I'm here with a subject matter that I have been trying to kick around for, I don't know, a couple of years, I suppose. And it's still basically a thought experiment. It might be nothing, but I thought I'd present it anyway. And this comes after many, many hours, years actually, of spending time on satellite imagery. That's right. Believe it or not, folks, I used to be back in the day, a real Google fanboy. That's right, I said it. Back when Street View, when Google was a different company, their motto was "Don't be evil." They came out with Street View. I thought that was a very interesting use of technology. I think it was San Francisco first when they first did that. Started scanning books, not asking for permission, putting things online. And I thought their company approach was refreshing. Now, like years later, you find out who the first investors were and things like that. And eventually the piper must play the tune that the payer prefers. Catch my drift. And so I've watched satellite imagery in general devolve a bit from the Street View days where before people's faces were even blurred and you could find interesting things happening. I understand scrubbing emergency situations and people who didn't ask to be filmed. I understand censoring those sorts of things. But I don't understand censoring certain areas and certain things to the point where it becomes unreliable. Are these pictures or not of this place? And if they are, why can you get images like this? And if they are pictures, then there's a lot of things that don't add up. And if they're just photographs from satellites up in orbit, then why are they so inconsistent as far as the dates? You would think that they would update at the same rate, but there are areas that have not been updated in 10 years and areas that are updated very frequently. So I'm not sure what they're using to take these photographs. Planes flying at different heights, balloons, I'm not sure. But for one example, we're told about this Pacific garbage patch that's floating out in the ocean that's miles and miles long, there's no photographic evidence of this on satellite photography, and I do believe it exists. I've seen this condition of some of the rivers, and I would imagine that ends up somewhere. But the ocean itself seems to be sort of just painted over, like this area out here in Guam, for example. I'm not sure if this exists, this sort of data grid, and there's lots of things like that. In fact, let me show you my map here. You can tell I've been very, very active over the years on this map. These are all pins I've dropped or areas of interest and various clues. Some of them end up being nothing. Some of them end up being, some are still under investigation and some of them are still a mystery. I suppose most of them will remain a mystery. There was a period of time where a friend and I were looking at things and were pretty fixated on Antarctica as being a kind of a red flag of the idea that things aren't exactly the way we're told. There's so many bizarre anomalies and unexplainable things down there, but really there's never any response. You would think if you took photographs of the entire world and made them available for people, there'd be some way you can contact someone and ask for explanations of certain things or what they're seeing or tell them to look into. But it's just always crickets. No, that's not what you're seeing. It's pareidolia, and pareidolia is real, 100%. At one point, I spent so much time looking at these images that you do start to see things that are not there. And the easiest way to tell it is when you stop looking at them and you look at a different sort of surface, like a sidewalk or something, you see those same sort of fanciful images and you realize, okay, well, my brain is doing weird things. But there are some things that would be easier to explain as not being correct if the footage were more consistent. When you have corners cut off like this, when you have panels that are completely out of place, or you have power lines that are stretched out across the land that routinely disappear behind frames of generic earth underneath tiles that seem planted, it does make you wonder who's in control of the censoring. Who do you call to have something altered? How is it that certain cities have the homeless people scrubbed off of their streets when you do Street View? Or even better, perhaps, I'll give you a concrete example. This is a place I'm very familiar with, and this is a beach that has over the years had much of the sand removed. Just the tides just pulling it away. The beach used to stretch out for, I'm not sure, 50 yards at least, sometimes a high tide, maybe even higher, a low tide at night, and it was a vast beach. Very rarely, if ever, would the water reach up here to these rock footings. And these are pictures here that I took a year ago, maybe two, and you can see there's no sand on this beach, just rocks. There's just rocks. Water breaks right here on the base of these. However, if you were to consult Google Earth on the matter, you will see that there is still plenty of beach. And I don't know why this is. Is it to protect tourism in the area? And I wonder why. Is it to promote tourism in the area? Is it the same way you would remove the homeless from the streets? Is it to just promote that your city is being better, maybe better maintained than it is. I'm not sure, but I would call that a very deceptive practice. One of the joys of Street View is being able to look and see what an area is like before you actually go there. So to entertain these notions of censorship that are selective, it makes you question the entire operation. Who has that kind of power to present a false image of a place to the world under the pretense that it's just live photography? And I don't appreciate that. Why would I make a video about aerial photography and trying to decode certain elements of it if I'm dismissing it and downplaying it? Well, I want to be fair and say it's not always accurate. I'm aware of its flaws. And I've been engaged in many investigations online, watched several unfold before me, and they have been compelling, to say the least. There are anomalies, and there are glitches, and there is obvious censorship, and there's obviously some sort of filter at certain times put on areas to, I suppose, lessen the impact of the idea of the reality of it, of how oddly and disturbingly close some of this photography is to, say, a bedroom window. Looking at these things from above, one often comes to the conclusion that this layout of many of these cities look very much like a circuit board. Oftentimes when you have a close-up tilt-shift photography style image of a circuit board, you cannot tell it's not a city, which does make you wonder why this is the case. Circuit boards are usually designed so that the flow of information will be optimal, and I imagine most cities were designed with this same concept of goods arriving, imports, exports, supply chains, and things of this matter. But I wonder, are the creators of circuit boards intentionally mimicking the layout of cities? Or is it just a pattern that we fall into? Or is it simply the most effective, and because of that, both city planners and circuit board designers have stumbled upon the same sorts of layout? I'm not sure. With cities, you'd imagine it's some combination of form or function. With circuit boards, I would imagine it's merely function. But it is very interesting, and it gets more interesting when you consider the repeating patterns that stretch across all land, and the layouts of the cities that seem to transcend culture, transcend location, transcend everything that you would think would impact the design of a city or town. It's worth noting that we are not creating new cities. Most towns and cities are simply populated areas that have incorporated, and the communities have already existed. So since 1850 or so, or the early 1900s at the latest, every city in America was formed, or every populated area, which is interesting, considering so many of them share the same characteristics. You would think that at some point we would have improved on this compared to a city like, say, Paris, or some of the towns in older parts of Europe, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. So this is a curious thing. And there are a number of curious things with this, and I have been puzzling for a long time. I know I've been hinting at certain things, but I didn't feel like I had enough data, and so I had to go back to the board, keep trying to confirm the things that I saw, if this were true. At some point, I began to notice certain features in many cities and towns across the world that were similar, and obviously can be explained when you look at the architectural similarities and things like that we're told exist everywhere. As we talk about on this channel often, I mean, the stories don't quite make sense with the history. It seems like someone else was responsible for the construction of many of these buildings. It doesn't seem plausible that it was early Americans in such a short period of time. We also talk about deeper meaning of a lot of these buildings and speculate on why the true history would be hidden from us. And this plays largely into that. One thing I have noticed is that nearly every time, I shouldn't say nearly every time, but there are many cases while following the railroad or following the canal system and looking over these areas that I have discovered that oftentimes, too often for my mind to stretch to a coincidence, when the canal and the railroad intersect, where there's a crossing, this shape is often found within a mile or nearby. Now, I stretch the definition of canal a bit because I think many of these rivers, depending on the thickness and the length of time they stay a certain length, and depending on the route, have more in common with a canal than an actual river. But anytime there's a crossing, now certain cities, they may cross multiple times, but usually it's the first major crossing. As these canals and these railroad tracks meander their way across the country, across the land, it's not just America, it's everywhere. When they finally intersect, usually it's at a city, and there's almost always this shape here. Now, the obvious thought and pushback on that is, so what? That's just a football field or a track and field or a soccer field. And of course, every city has those. And it wouldn't be unreasonable to presume that in every major city, of course, you're going to have an intersection of a canal and the railroad at some point. Seems common sense. Seems like there's nothing there, and there may not be. But it does make one wonder why it is so that every city has these things. And as we've discussed, many of the cities here and were founded and initially laid out 200 years ago. And I wonder about the relationship, because what we're told is that the railway, after putting forth monumental effort, an impossible effort, in constructing these canals, digging them all across the United States where there weren't already for transportation and shipping of goods, that they were abruptly abandoned, largely, almost immediately, for the railroad. Yet they exist, and they are everywhere, and the railroad put up with pretty much the same amount of speed at length of time. And some of these canals have been turned into roads, highways, railroad tracks. Some of them have been, I'd say the chances of this happening, or the amount of times this happened at this intersection, probably much higher. But I'm not looking at old historic canal routes. I was only looking at current flowing water. So while I found almost a 90% success rate when looking for intersections like this to finding this loop. Now, that's not to say that every loop has a nearby crossing, but almost every crossing has a loop, what I'm calling a loop. So this got me into looking at the land differently and wondering, perhaps this seems completely irrational, but wondering what came first. For this experiment, I choose to look at these cities as if I were a stranger visiting, knew nothing about humans, knew nothing about our society, knew nothing at all. Just looking down at it and observing the way you would like an anthill, and going from anthill to anthill and trying to piece together what's going on underneath. In looking at it that way, I've narrowed down a number of shapes that seem to be important to these people down here, shapes that I find in every city, and wondering what their purpose is. And these are those shapes. From above, we're going to call this the oval, which obviously would be a track and field or soccer track or race car track to the people down below. But from up above, you don't know that. I've already mentioned the water and the railroad tracks. These patches here, which I call bullseye patches, seem to hold importance because they're in every city, everywhere. You would probably only know them as to be courtyards or maybe gardens. This little dirt pentagon here, which you would know as a baseball diamond. These little buttons, which are typically in the middle of roads. You would probably see them from down below as a fountain or a monument or in a courtyard. This track here, this segmented track, which looks sort of like a mason's compass sometimes it's a complete X, but it's very distinct in the layout of it, the angle of it, and the fact that the track has little segments here. This seems to be very important to these people, as they're everywhere. And there's also a sort of retention area we often find here with these sand loops and these hilly mounds. And this is the conclusion that I've come to as the visiting stranger from outside, that these shapes are important to these people. They are in every city. And there's a connection between the railway and the canal and this loop. This is just what I've come to from looking at it from this point of view. Now, obviously, from the human point of view, this would make sense in a way, because you would say, well, yes, naturally, these are golf courses and this is just gardens. And while it is a little odd that they are everywhere in the world, so yeah, from that point of view, it makes sense that these shapes that some stranger would see as being important everywhere together in the same areas over and over and over again. So then the conclusion, the official story, is that these are all man-made and they all have function. But are there any outliers to this? Is there any reason to believe that actually the shape came first and the function came later? Any reason to believe that these shapes exist despite what we're told they're used for? When I began to look at things this way, it actually brought back some things I had looked at in the past. So looking at them again under this new light, there are abundance of shapes and tracks and weird things that exist outside of cities that appear to have no basis in society or no reason to exist. You can probably find them anywhere in the world you'd like, and most of them have explanations that are perfectly sound and reasonable. But I'll start with some that are just local. That out here in the desert of Arizona, which now these are pretty commonly known, but they weren't, I don't think, until there was more air travel and more satellite or aerial photography. But that's all these little triangles and angles and concentric circles and shapes out here, and these iron crosses out here in the Arizona desert. And many of them, we're told, are just military target practices or for photography accuracy. And I suppose now, a while back, I was looking at the Hohokam, what I call hoax, The Hohokam aren't really a real tribe. It's just a name of a people. It just means that was who came before. But one of the very first national landmarks that was ever created in this entire country was out here. The Pima National Monument is a place called Snaketown. And this is what it looks like on the map. And that's what it looks like in person. There's nothing there. Literally nothing there. Except for this one dirt loop that we're told is most likely a dance floor or a ball court. So the fact that these people don't have an official culture and existed thousands of years ago, no one knows anything about them. The fact that we know that they like to dance and play ball is interesting. And this came to my attention because there's people who come through the area they're trying to visit all the national landmarks, and no one locally knows anything about it. and because there's nothing to know. But the thing of interest that what this brought back to me is there's a nearby other shape that appears to have no meaning. And it is this little segmented little track here that you would call an airport runway. And I have been to this place multiple times. In fact, I almost died in this field choking on a ham sandwich before I realized that the idea that I was going to die the same way Mama Cass did so enraged me that I found the strength to expel the item from my throat. I'm not kidding. So in a way, Mama Cass saved my life. Actually, what we have here is this abandoned airfield we'd found as kids, and we called it an airplane graveyard. And since these planes have been deteriorated and graffitied and abandoned, I had been back there a few years ago, taking some pictures and things and asking around about it. And I've been told that years ago, the military or the Air Force, one of the local Air Force bases, had asked the farmer who owned the land if he could park some planes here, and they were going to use this as a runway for emergency landings and things like that. They agreed. They brought the planes here, never returned ever again, just left them there to deteriorate. And so the thought occurred to me, here you have this field that's not used as an airfield at all, this shape. Here you have this same little loop over here, very similar, that's now been sort of covered up. And they're both given these ridiculous stories. One just parked some planes on there that you clearly don't need to sell people on the idea that it's an airport. Maybe because now satellite photography was becoming a thing and they realized they couldn't hide some of these areas. I don't know, but it seems like a little bit of a cover-up. That was my suspicion anyway. But I'm suspicious of everything, so I sort of put it to bed. And I will, of course, mention that there is a railroad and a canal crossing very nearby in the vicinity of this loop, so in case you're wondering. And so I've looked around other areas and tried to find evidence to support the idea that these shapes were actually there first, and they perhaps have a different meaning than we've assigned them. Now, it seems like a vast cover-up that's far too large to be possible. Well, I come across this article here about these Arizona desert crosses. There's a series of concrete iron crosses that are all across the desert out there. And the official story is that they're used to test spy satellite photography. And they're all out across the desert near Casa Grande. And one of them has a bronze marker on it that says 1966, and it has the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers label on it. There's an article in NPR, Morning Edition, that was a story about these spy satellites and these big 60-foot-long concrete crosses that are found out here, and it's called Decades-Old Mystery Put to Rest. Why are there X's in the desert? So this story, which I talked about, these two guys who were flying their plane across, they saw them, and they wondered what they were. They reached out to the Army Corps of Engineers, and at first they didn't know. The Army Corps of Engineers eventually responded with connection, told them they got hold of some retired guys, and it was a series of these satellite photography tests. Well, I found this article here, and it's written by someone who writes for Space Review, and they're a real space nerd, and so they know all about the spy satellite system in question, which was called Corona. And this article, this man tells them that this man knew all about Corona, and he knew that the documents for this program had been declassified in 1995, and he'd read all of them. He was very familiar with them. And he is flummoxed why the government would build a fixed optical range specifically for this Corona after 1966, since the Corona program was shut down, and it was never mentioned in any of the documents anywhere, any of these targets, any of these sites. And the targets were supposedly abandoned due to shifting caused by groundwater pumping. But all the sources on the Wikipedia article are inadequate. They don't connect anything. This person goes on in very technical terms to talk about how 306 large fixed targets would have no purpose. The range would be worthless to certain cameras. He's confused by the orbital shift due to Earth's rotation and the timelines. They couldn't guarantee that the Corona mission would ever even pass over the desert. And he goes into very technical tirade reporting that this is false. This has to be false. There's only a few fixed targets that were ever used for photographic evaluation in this program inside Arizona, and none of them look like this, and none of them are anywhere near Casa Grande. They actually look like this. And this is the same pattern that U.S. government's been using since the 50s, never 60-foot wide concrete crosses. So, and he also talks about the fact that why would this article in the Casa Grande newspaper be talking about a secret spy program that was used to combat the Soviets? They wouldn't. And until none of this was declassified until 95. So this is interesting to me always when someone who is not suspicious of the powers that be debunks something based on their expertise. And I take their word for it. Absolutely right. I haven't read any, I know nothing about this Corona satellite program, but he's indignant about it. The hilarious part to me is he is making the case that this viral momentum, the story being passed around social media, it's not going to die. And this is a problem because this is perpetuating misinformation because of its air of mystery, its very selective analysis information, its incomplete and inadequate sources, and combining that with the feeling of being able to solve a mystery, he claims that this is the perfect recipe for a conspiracy theory. And in my mind, that's hilarious to think that this is creating the conspiracy, because in my mind, the cover-up article is the conspiracy. The cover-up article is the fake answer to the question. Then this person just thoroughly debunked it because he knew more about the satellite program than most people. It does make you wonder why they would have to make up origins for these things and lie about what they're for. Now, what could these shapes have to do? How could they have possibly come about if not man-made? I don't know. But I do know I found other things that also defy logic, such as this unbroken trail of trees that I discovered about a year or two ago out here, which stretch all the way from the Black Sea, all the way up into Russia, through Europe and Asia at their thickest points, essentially. And they get broken, and the lines are broken here and there, knocked askew. They cut at insanely sharp right angles. Nothing ever grows in between them. They seem to be attached to the earth. They seem to grow in a special, it's almost like a terraforming, almost like someone dragged a paint tool across the landscape and forever fixated them. Wherever the lines were broken by floods or rivers, wherever that ground ended up, still was able to grow, and nothing else between. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. I've heard various explanations for it. None of them make that much sense. Nonetheless, who's maintaining them like this? And these lines are thick. They're the thickness of a football field each. And it brings to mind some sort of connection with the earth itself, as if they could only grow this way in certain patterns or rows, sort of like a circuit board where there's only different places where you can attach the various nodes. And so it does make you wonder if the earth, if some of these patterns aren't just affected by certain magnetic or energetic things passing through and leaving a mark on the soil or the earth behind it. And that's why it can only grow in certain places, or it grows in certain patterns. And maybe that's why you see these everywhere. And this makes me wonder about the network of control in this land that seems to be centered around energy in general. I speak of this sort of hydra of power, and it's a group of establishments that seem to have exerted their control over every city and every society in its own way. And they're broken down sort of like this, where you have the government and all the things that the government are associated with, the libraries and the museums and the civil services, the post offices, the fire departments, things like this. And you have the military, you have the education system, universities, schools, and then you have the banking industry with its close ties to the insurance industries and the energy companies. Electricity, trains, waterways, and then, of course, you have to have the spiritual control, which would be the churches. And this group of man-made institutions seem to have a stranglehold on everything, on the flow of all information, and on the flow of energy, and the flow of commerce. And all of these things seem very interlinked. So is it possible to take this hydra of control, as I've just described, and sort of plant it on these shapes, or in these shapes, or assume that if these shapes were important for the movement of any sort of current, energy, or even just a functional society, is it possible that that's the case? And how would we even determine that? Like, for example, how would you know, if looking at this from the outside, if these shapes were indeed important, or if they're connected to? You would imagine that wherever they all were, there would also be a strong element of control, like say a military or a stronghold, a governmental stronghold, right? So for example, What do I suspect about this canal and this train? I don't know, but it would seem to me that if it's the case that if these intersecting has any meaning, it might be something to the tune of this. When I have a Christmas electric train on a Christmas tree, it's a very simple thing. You just apply the current and the train goes, just continuously loops. And if you hit it, reverse the current, it flows the opposite way. And I often wondered as a kid, why don't trains actually work like this instead of just burning steam and burning coal to get steam? And it seems like a pretty wasteful way to do that when the toy trains work so well. Well, perhaps they were like that. Perhaps they were like that. And perhaps on these long journeys, the canals also carried the current. And wherever they intersected on these old bridges, perhaps there was a rods that came extended down through the piers into the water and sort of recharged the train as it passed, just recharged the line. And at some point, that circuit needs a place to loop back around, and perhaps that's why you have these shapes always nearby. I'm just speculating. I don't know the tech. I don't have the technical knowledge to explain that. It's just what I'm seeing, and it's just an idea of why this could be the case. And perhaps that's why you have these old world bridges with all this sort of antennas and things on top. So maybe it had something to do with this energy system that was here before, that was perhaps free. And of course, they can't have that, so they've got to take control of these areas and dam up the rivers and sell the electricity back to us and convert the rail lines to just being coal powered to sell coal. And is it just all big grift? Maybe. That seems like a stretch though, right? But then if that's the case, how do you explain, what do you do with all these ovals that are everywhere? What do you do with all these tracks? You'd have to come up with a backstory for all of them, and that just seems almost impossible. Because everyone knows they're just for schools and track and field, and those are ancient traditions, right? Well, let's see. That would be ridiculous, right? I mean, if this were the case, then you would expect our leaders to want to have control over these areas in as many ways as they could. Well, then you come back to the fact that the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, manages about half the golf courses in the world. That can be easily explained by saying, well, they provide places for the military to play golf when they're off. That's not suspicious at all. Everywhere, no matter what country, these little golf courses are managed seem to contain all of these other pieces. So what am I implying? That these layouts were here first, and the shapes were assigned meaning later? Start out by saying, I don't believe that these controllers invented games. People play games with balls and sticks and whatever they've got. It's part of human nature. But with the right amount of nudging, can something that already exists be repurposed in a different light? Let's look at the history of some of these areas and see if that even seems plausible. Let's look at soccer, and let's look at the timeline on it. And you see, what you find out is that for centuries before the first meeting of the Football Association, of course, there were no universally accepted rules for playing football. There was the first version of the rules for the modern game was drawn up over a series of 6 meetings held in the Freemasons Tavern from October till December in 1863. So the game is being played for years and years, but the official rules and the official size of the field were determined in 1863 in the Freemasons Tavern. That is interesting. Let's look at American football. So we're told that first American football game was played in 1869 between 2 college teams using rules based on the rules of soccer. However, a set of rule changes were drawn up in 1880 by Walter Camp, the father of American football, which included reducing the field to a very specific size. This man, Walter Camp, was a Hopkins Grammar School, Yale College graduate, member of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, the Linnean Society, and Skull and Bones. And this is the father of American football. Interesting. I would have thought that American football came much later than 6 years after European football or soccer, but I guess not. Now we'll check out golf. Golf has been played in Scotland as early as 1672. This is the oldest golf course in the world by Guinness World Records. The oldest surviving rules were compiled in 1744 by the Company of Gentlemen Golfers. This was all in Scotland. However, the world's first golf tournament and first major was played in October 1860, and the game was first demonstrated golf in the United States by setting up a hole in 1888 in Yonkers, New York. So again, you've got a sport that's made official in 1860, and the rules refined in 1888. For football, 1869, with the rules refined in 1880. Then you have soccer, 1863, the rules were defined. And what about baseball? Baseball started out as a game called rounders, played in the 1700s in England. During the 1830s and 1840s, these amateur club baseball leagues started. The first game of baseball actually didn't take place in America was in Canada, 1838. Canada invented the version we know today, but innovations made by New York City clubs become the basis for the modern game. So in 1888, a group of men formed a committee, organized the rules, and one of the gentlemen's name was Spalding. They accompanied a group of players on a world tour to promote the game of baseball, playing an exhibition game in the shadow of the Great Pyramids of Egypt, hold dinners to honor the players, attended by Mark Twain, Theodore Roosevelt, and they were attempting to focus on the sport and frame it as America's ambassador to the world. Historians now say that they were trying to deliberately steer it away from the game of rounders, trying to make it a distinctly American thing. And so here again, you have baseball playing Code of Rules in the 1840s and finalized in 1880s. Baseball came before the others, huh? That is very interesting that within 20 years, all of these sports were developed. But surely that doesn't explain the track, right? Surely the track and field came first, right? Track and field has historic roots, the oldest of all sporting competitions, because running and jumping and throwing are natural and universal human physical expressions. This is what we're told. However, outside of the ancient Olympics, first recorded track and field competitions were in the 19th century on a race course in 1851. The story starts around 1856 with a gentleman named Dr. William Penny Brooks. He was the chairman of the gas company in Winlock, which first brought lighting to the town. He was also commissioner for roads and taxes. He was also overseer of the poor and a director of the railway company. He arranged for the first train to the town to coincide with the Olympic Games he set up in 1861. He was also a manager of the National School. He was a surgeon, a magistrate, a botanist, and an educationalist, and his lifelong campaign was to get physical education on the school curriculum. He helped set up the National Olympic Association, and the first game was played in 1866 at the Crystal Palace in London. And it was there that he met a gentleman named Baron de Coubertin, who was a French educator and historian, also co-founded the International Olympic Committee, and it was its second president. He's known as the father of the modern Olympic Games, and he was particularly active in promoting the introduction of sport in French schools. He was a French aristocrat with Jesuit education, and he spent years organizing an international meeting of athletes and sports enthusiasts that might make it happen. The two of them combined to host the official Olympics in 1899. They also held the Olympic Games at the Paris Exposition in 1900 and the Louisiana Purchase Expedition in 1904. So the Amateur Athletic Union in America formed in 1888. In France in 1889, and thusly, the Olympic Games were revived from prehistory to 1896 was the first Summer Olympics. This is also when they consolidated the measurements for the fields. So how about that? The baseball came before the Olympics. These coincidences are a little too hard for me to ignore. Is it possible? And, I really hope that I'm not accurate. There's enough weird mystery in the world for this to be added on top. I really hope that I'm wrong here, but I'm suspecting that there's something a lot more to this. So this man, Baron de Coubertin, right, the father of the Olympic, pretty much boarded at the school raised by Jesuit priests, becomes an officer of the school's elite academy, an aristocrat. This man advocated heavily for gymnasiums and for track and field to be incorporated into more school. William Penny Brooks, this man who also makes it his life's mission to get physical education onto the school curriculum, of which he succeeded. So let me see if I get this straight. Around the time all these cities were developing, around the time of the railroad and the canals were being constructed, around this time, the same time frame, you get things like track and field, golf, football, soccer, and baseball that are refined at this point. People have been playing them for years, various ways, various rules. The industries are set up, the committees are set up, and the rules are defined, as well as the size of the playing fields are encoded, the size of the tracks, and they are also injected and forced into education, which is enforced onto the people. So a school now has to be featured in every town and every city, and that school has to have a track and field, and presumably a baseball diamond. Isn't that just perfect? And you just so happen to have these games being designed, invented, and refined by Jesuits, members of the Skull and Bones, and Freemasons. I would call that a red flag. And then you couple that with the idea that half the golf courses are owned by the military, and you start to get the suspicion that all of these things were simply invented to explain why the land looks the way it does, why there are these diamonds with dirt where plants don't grow, and these loops, they're sort of burned into the earth from whatever was going on here before. And had to explain it all away. They just take something that already exists and then shift it. And oddly enough, one of the rules in baseball is that the inner diamond has to be exactly the same specifications, but the outside doesn't matter. Which is kind of what you would expect if the inside part where the dirt, where the grass can't grow, is the only part that you care about. That would make sense. That's the only part you have to explain away. And so maybe that's why, this way, they've covered their ass in case dirigibles or airplanes fly over areas and see baseball diamonds and loops everywhere. Suddenly it's no longer a mystery, and suddenly it doesn't mean anything. It's just we all play the same sports, and instead we're given these illusions that America's strictly baseball is America's, and track and field has been around forever, and really, yeah, games have been around forever. And people love them and take them, obviously, to extreme lengths, and now they're massive moneymakers. But could it be possible that it all started as a bit of a hoax, a way to explain away some of the stuff that was already there, and to force this story onto people the same way they are doing now with target practices out in the desert? And there are dozens of these shapes out everywhere in the desert that don't make sense. They plant this seed and it works. They are able to finalize the size of this track and essentially get every culture to buy in and force it under the education so that every school needs one. Then this would perpetuate itself to infinity. As much as I hate to say it, the association and the stated missions of these men, even what leaks out, what little leaks out through their little biographies, it seems to me that this is just part of the deception. I don't know. I hope that's not the case, but the advent of all these at the same time, the same decade, just seems impossible that such coordination could exist. So many anomalies, and it always comes back to the same groups. Do you think, is it all a dirty trick? Or am I grabbing at straws here? Let me know, and I'll see you soon.